Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Orkin. I'm a researcher at the Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford. We'd like to welcome you to the Labour Day for the CSAE Conference 2021. We've got an exciting set of 3 sessions to go, and I'll now hand over to Lukas Hensel, who's also a researcher at the Center and has some exciting work on labour markets, and will be chairing the session. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for the nice introduction. As Kate said, my name is Lukas Hensel. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center at CSAE, and I'll be chairing the first session today on job training. Before I introduce the speakers to you, let me briefly talk you through the ground rules of these sessions at the conference. So the format of the session is we'll give each speaker 15 minutes to present, so 60 minutes in total, followed by a 20-minute of questions and answers after all the presentations are done. So this will be a joint Q&A for all presentations. Okay, having covered this ground, I'm really excited to introduce our 4 speakers at this session. The first speaker and presenter will be Annabelle Doerr from the University of Basel, who's going to present on a job training program in Chile. And our second speaker is Simon Quinn, who, I'm a professor at the University of Oxford and who will present on a job search assistance program for refugees in Jordan. Our third speaker is going to be James Walsh, also at the University of Oxford from the Blavatnik School of Government, who's going to present on a field experiment in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And finally, our fourth speaker is Laurel from the University of Alberta, presenting an experiment based in South Africa. So very excited to see all your presentations, and I'll hand it over to you, Annabelle.
So thanks for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to present here today. So I will talk about a job training program for disadvantaged individuals in Chile, and this is joint work with Rafael Novella from the UCL. So Chile is one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America and the Caribbean region. And this positive economic development is reflected by a large increase in the GDP, which increased from $9,000 in the year 2000 to $15,000 17 years later. And also by a reduction in the poverty rate from 36% to 9% over the last 20 years. However, the country still faces many challenges when it comes to the reduction of inequality and the improvement of human capital. So, for example, there is a reported income and employment gap for women and other disadvantaged groups. The unemployment rate is relatively low with 8%. However, many workers work in informality, which means that they do not contribute to social security. And when we focus on PISA test scores or the completion rate in secondary education, we see below OECD average performance of Chile. So in this context, job training received a lot of attention in many Latin American countries. And although Chile is a pioneer country in implementing job training programs, there's only very limited evidence on their effectiveness in Chile. So there are some experimental evaluations that report positive effects on employment and earnings. However, experimental evidence is only available for other Latin American countries and not for Chile. So in our paper, we present the first experimental evaluation of a job training program in Chile, and we do so by using data from a randomized control trial that we match with extensive survey data and administrative records. And this gives us the opportunity to estimate short, medium, and long-term effects on labor market and skill outcomes. So the program that we consider in our paper is called FOTRAP, which stands for Formación para el Trabajo, and which means training for work. And this program is offered to all individuals that live in vulnerable conditions in Chile. And vulnerability is defined by the so-called FPS score, which is a country-wide used instrument to target public social programs. And eligibility here in this FOTRAP program was defined by belonging to the first 2 quintiles of the FPS score distribution. What is interesting in the program is that it was not restricted to specific groups such as unemployed or specific age groups or gender groups. Instead, FODRAP was targeted to employed as well as unemployed women and men aged between 18 and 65 years and belong to the most disadvantaged in the country. So the main aims of or objectives of FODRAP is to increase the human capital formation and to improve labor market outcomes by increasing the cognitive and non-cognitive skills of participants and by improving their employability and wages, and especially for individuals that wish to become self-employed in the future, the program should provide them with the necessary skills to do that. So FODRAP was financed by the Chilean government and existed until 2018. So the courses that belong to the FODRAP program can be mainly classified in 3 types, which is classroom training, classroom plus job training, and classroom plus technical assistance training. So in the most basic course type, participants received classroom training of at least 250 hours, which provides them with occupation-specific and transversal skills. They also were provided with an accidents insurance during participation. They received a food and transportation subsidy, and at the end of the course, certificate and licenses. And the 2 other program types or course types had some components on top. So for the job training course, there were additionally on the job training and job finding support, and participants in technical assistance courses received in addition technical assistance and a subsidy for tools. So the third course type, which is technical assistance, was mainly targeted to individuals with the wish to become self-employed in the future. Okay, so let me now explain you the experimental setting. So the evaluation was implemented as a randomized control trial among 1 cohort of applicants to FODRAP in the year 2013. The randomization was implemented with an oversubscription design in 123 courses, which means that provider of these courses had to prepare a list that was twice the capacity for each course. And then the applicants on this list were divided into men and female, and then within these courses and by gender randomly assigned to control and treatment group. Overall, we received applications from 5,200 individuals. So since the participation in FODRAP was not enforced, we observed 36% of assigned individuals that never showed up or dropped out early. And in this case, training providers had the opportunity to fill empty slots with individuals from the control group. In theory, this should have happened randomly. However, in practice, we cannot be sure that this was really a random reassignment procedure. And for this reason, we did some robustness checks in our empirical analysis by just excluding the reassigned, and the results remained fairly stable to this. Here to show you some numbers. So we end up with 3,600 individuals being assigned to participate in the program. 1,500 were not assigned, and the participation rate was about 67%, almost 70%, meaning that 2,400 individuals participated in the end in the FODRAP courses. This experimental setting gives us the opportunity to estimate 2 interesting parameters. The first is the intention to treat effect, which is the effect of being assigned to the program. Or to say it in other words, the effect of making the program available in a setting where participation cannot be enforced. And second, we estimate the effect for the compliers by using the random assignment as instrument for participation. And in our case, control individuals were not able to assign themselves to the program. So this opens or faces us with the situation of one-sided non-compliance. And in this case, the effect of the compliers is equal to the treatment effect on the treated, which is the effect of participation in the program. Okay, so let me say some words on data collection and give you a short description of the sample. So we collected data at 3 points of time. First, at the beginning of the courses in an extensive baseline survey, then 1.5 years later in the first follow-up survey, and then again about 3 years later in a second follow-up survey. We collected a huge amount of information like socio-demographic characteristics, household characteristics, information about educational degrees and labor market experience. We asked the respondents about their current labor market situation, and we implemented extensive measures measurement tests for cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So in the interest of time, I will not present you large balancing tables. However, I will give you a short description of the sample. So about 60% in the sample are women. They are on average 33 years old. They are relatively poor with an FPS score of 5,800. So the eligibility criteria was an FPS score of 11,000. Almost half of the individuals were employed in the last year before the baseline survey took place. They are married, they have an average 2 kids, and the education variables points towards a middle to high skilled sample. What I can say is that all characteristics are very well balanced between the assigned and not assigned applicants. Okay, so then let me turn to the results. So here you can see the impact of the FOTRAM program on labor outcomes. In the first row, I show you the intention to treat effect. In the second, the first stage for the complier effect. In the third, the treatment effect on the treated. Then in the fourth row, the average means, the means for the control group and the number of observations. And as you can see, we find 0 effects for paid employment. We find nothing for self-employment. However, we find some positive effects in the short run for labor income. For those who were assigned to the program, we observed an increase in labor income of 9,000 Chilean pesos, which is about $16 at that time. And in percentage, it is an increase of 5% compared to the control group. And for those who were assigned and participated in the program, the effect's a little bit larger with about 13,000 Chilean pesos, which corresponds to an increase of 8%. So here you see the results that we obtain when we merge the data from the experiment to administrative records. So in this case, we can estimate the effects on formal employment and formal income over a period of 4 years. So you can see there are lock-in effect for both outcomes, which simply occurs because participants reduce their search intensity during participation. Then there is a sharp increase for employment as well as income. However, over the medium and long run, the program effects turn never significant. So then we ask ourselves if these 0 effects might be explained by 0 skill improvement. So here you can see the impacts on skill outcomes. We find some positive development for cognitive skills. However, in the longer run, there is nothing on cognitive skills and also nothing on non-cognitive skills.
Annabelle, so then, just to let you know, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Then in the next step, we did a subgroup analysis by course type. So here you can see the effects for the 3 different course types, which is classroom training in the panel A and panel B, classroom with job training, and in panel C, the technical assistance courses. So for the classroom training, we find a positive effect on labor income in the long run, which corresponds to 27,000 Chilean pesos. And this is an increase of 20% compared to the control group. For job training courses, we find negative effect on paid employment and also in labor income in the longer run. And for the technical assistance courses, we find a positive effect on self-employment in the short term. And this is very plausible because these courses were targeted to individuals with a wish to become self-employed in the future. And we see some substitution effect with paid employment. However, this is not significant. For skill outcomes, we find a negative effect on non-cognitive skills for classroom training, nothing on job training. And for the technical assistance courses, we find positive effects for cognitive skills as well as non-cognitive skills in the short term, which is a very positive effect. So then in my last result slide, we thought, okay, maybe course and provider quality make a difference. And so we used data from a survey of training providers and constructed an index of course and provider quality. And here you can see the results for the assigned individuals in lower quality courses, and then as interaction effect, the difference to high quality courses. And for classroom training, we see that the positive long-term effect is completely driven by individuals assigned to high quality courses. There's again nothing for job training courses. And for the technical assistance courses, we again find a difference between the course quality. So for those assigned to low quality courses, there's a negative income effect, and for those in high quality courses, the effect is significantly positive. Okay, so where does this leave us? For classroom training, we find positive effect on income, then cannot be explained by the skill improvement, but could be driven by a positive signaling effect of certificates obtained from high quality providers. For the second type, we find negative effects on paid employment and income in the long run, which are not related to the skill development and also not driven by provider quality. So this definitely needs further investigation. And for the technical assistance courses, we find short-term positive effects on the probability to be self-employed that is related to an improvement in cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And we also find that income effects differ between low and high quality courses, which again points towards signaling effects. So to wrap up, our study reveals that FORTRAP had only limited effectiveness. The effect of the program seemed to differ by course type. We find that technical assistance courses improve the development of cognitive skills, which results in an increase in the probability to be self-employed. And we find that course and provider quality explain some of the positive labor income effects, and this points towards the existence of signaling. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. That was perfectly on time and super interesting. Okay, I just hand over to our next speaker already. As I said before, we'll take questions at the end. So our next speaker is Simon Quinn from the University of Oxford. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Lukas, can I just check that you can all hear me okay? Very good.
Yes.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining, wherever in the world you are. In the discussion with the panelists before everyone was allowed into the virtual room, one of the other people told me that they had been looking forward to seeing me present on a nimble experimental design. In my entire life, I think this is the first time that I've been used in the same sentence as nimble, but everything is relative and I will take the compliment. I'm certainly here today to talk about an adaptive targeted field experiment. And this is an experiment that we conducted with refugees in Jordan and with low-skilled Jordanians. And I'll talk about that in a moment, of course. This is co-authored work with Stefano Currier, Grant Gordon, Max Casey, Sohar Shami, and Alex Tatelboim. So by way of a very brief overview, what we do in this paper is that we propose and we implement an algorithm that we see as balancing two competing objectives. First, precise treatment effect estimation, and second, welfare maximization for study participants. I think it's worth pausing on that sentence just for a moment, because I must say, as someone who has run a bunch of RCTs over the years, I tend to think that as experimenters, we tend to focus exclusively on the first one of these two in our design. And we often think, and indeed genuinely do, care a lot about the second one. But this is a paper that really thinks about how we can incorporate both of these simultaneously in the same design. The basic idea is simple, that when participants are sampled over time, we can use information about the outcomes of earlier cohorts to optimize treatment assignment for later cohorts. And we think that this approach can be particularly valuable in a number of different contexts. I don't say every context, of course, but particularly as we think about taking experiments to vulnerable populations, and particularly as the scale and scope of experiments is growing. By way of a quick overview, if you thought of yourself as having a relatively small sample that you were then going to use to make a once and for all decision for a large population, then a traditional RCT approach surely makes a lot of sense. But if you're thinking about experimenting in a dynamic context where you care about the welfare maximization of the particular participants in your study, then some kind of trade-off of the kind that we explore in this paper is likely to be valuable. Now, what we do specifically in this paper is to test 3 job search support interventions, and respectively, they provide cash, which we see as relaxing credit constraints, particularly for job search. Second, information on how to approach the labor market in a context where the labor market is unfamiliar for many of our key participants. And third, a package of behavioral nudges that we see as addressing self-control problems. Now, we implement this experiment in Jordan with a sample that includes both Syrian refugees and also vulnerable Jordanians. And we do this in partnership with the International Rescue Committee. Now, what do we find? Well, after 6 weeks, we find very small impacts on employment of our treatments. Our algorithm increases impacts by about 1 percentage point on average. After 2 and 4 months in a different genre of survey, and I can come back to that point, we actually do find large impacts of the cash grant, and we find that on both refugee employment, job retention, and earnings. But the impacts of the other interventions appear to be much more short-lived, and throughout we find no impacts on Jordanians. Now, how do we see this paper as contributing? Well, really it's speaking to two different ideas, which we see as coming together in an interesting way in this context. First, this is providing unique experimental evidence on the labor market constraints faced by refugees in a developing country. There's a lot of interesting ongoing experimental work in the field on these and related issues. And unfortunately, I guess this is the kind of policy issue that is important and will continue to be important as we see large flows of people across national borders. Second, as I've foreshadowed, we also talk about a novel algorithm for targeted adaptive treatment assignment, which we see as potentially having relevance to a wide range of other contexts, including beyond refugees and beyond labor markets. As we cite here, there's both recent literature and studies in the field that are thinking about implementing using similar ideas. So let me tell you about the treatments that we test. The first treatment is cash. Motivated by a basic observation that job search can be costly and that financial resources might activate job seekers to search harder. So what we do in response to this literature is that we offer an unconditional transfer to the value of about $90 US or 65 Jordanian dinar at the time of writing. What does that mean? Well, here we've got an empirical CDF of the baseline where we think about the average expenditure on job search in the last 7 days. And you can essentially see that what this indicates is that with these 65 Jordanian dinar, this would be sufficient for the average job seeker to double her or his search expenditure for a full 9 weeks. So this is quite a substantial cash grant. Second, we have a treatment that thinks about information. And this is particularly thinking about the fact that we've got Syrian refugees in Jordan who may not have a lot of familiarity with local norms or indeed legal protections in this labor market. So this intervention, as we say, is designed to fill this information gap, provides information on both the formal job search and application process and also what to expect from a formal job. We do this using a trained officer and the aid of flyers and 2 short videos. And the third intervention is really a related bundle of behavioral interventions motivated by some really exciting recent behavioral literature thinking about how you might encourage job search through these kind of behavioral nudges. So we provide a job search planning session where participants are given a job search calendar and we send SMS reminders. So in sum, we've got 3 distinct treatments here in addition to a control group, and we see each of these treatments as being very much inspired by recent empirical literature thinking about active labor market policies in low-income settings, appropriately adapted to this particular context. Now, we're looking about study participants here who are sampled continuously from February to November 2019. We required people to be 18 to 45 years old, and we asked them to be willing to take up a new low-skilled wage in the immediate future. And in particular, it's worth noting that we quite deliberately followed the International Rescue Committee's standard sampling procedures here, which is to say that we should think of this sample as representing the kind of population who would be exposed to a large international NGO implementing policies designed to help them. This is not designed to speak about the population of refugees in general. We're going to have a number of different follow-ups. We have a rapid response survey that measures wage employment with a short phone call 6 weeks after intake. And this survey here is designed solely for the purpose of seeding the algorithm that I'll describe shortly. We then have full follow-up surveys conducted by somebody who is familiar to the respondent 2 and 4 months after intake. That distinction between an unfamiliar person making a phone call after 6 weeks and somebody who is familiar to the respondent after 2 and 4 months is likely to be important in interpreting our results, and I'll come back to that. Now, we're going throughout this paper to condition on 4 binary covariates, that's to say 2 to the power of 4 equals 16 strata, and they are firstly nationality, Jordanian or not, effectively Jordanian versus Syrian in this context, gender, a dummy for being female, education, a dummy for having completed high school or more, and work experience, a dummy for having experience in wage employment. Okay, so let me tell you about our design. As I alluded to earlier, we have 2 objectives here. First, learning about the kind of treatments that will work for this population. And second, optimizing outcomes in a way that we seek to maximize welfare. To do that, we use a variation on an algorithm known as Thompson sampling. Now, Thompson sampling, dating back all the way to 1933, is a very simple and very elegant and very beautiful idea. It says at each given point in time t, you should assign an individual in, say, a particular stratum to a given treatment with a probability p hat, which in this context for Thompson refers to the probability that you think that a given treatment is the optimal treatment for that individual. So if you're thinking about strata, for example, you simply have some kind of model that tells you what is the probability that each of your treatments is the best treatment of the set for that individual. Use that probability as the weight to assign that treatment. Now, this is a very nice algorithm. What it means is that later cohorts are more likely to be assigned to treatments that perform well. You simply need a decent model to allow the system to learn in order to update this probability as a function of your earlier data. As we mentioned here, it has some nice properties, including regret converging to 0 at the fastest possible rate, at least in the large sample limit. But there are also some drawbacks. As you'll see, we stop learning about treatments that the algorithm has, quote unquote, decided are not the optimal treatment. So as the probability of assignment approaches 0, you discard treatments, which is what you might want from a welfare maximizing perspective, but you stop learning. And there are other econometric issues as well. So here we implement a variation on Thompson, which we call tempered Thompson, which is simply a convex combination of a standard Thompson algorithm and a simple equal weight RCT, where here the number 0.25 is just meant as 1 divided by 4, being 3 treatments in control. So notice that we have gamma equals 1 giving a standard RCT, gamma equals 0 giving the pure Thompson algorithm. And in our setup, without much formal guidance, we intuitively went for gamma equals 0.2. Now, this allows us to trade off the two objectives that I outlined earlier. It means that regret converges to a defined constant. It also means that our procedure yields asymptotically unbiased estimators, and you can either use Bayesian posteriors or perform randomization inference, both of which we do. But in fact, we even have a result that standard inference methods work in large samples. Now, in order to implement this, we use a Bayesian hierarchical model. So I won't take you through all 3 of these equations, but just to explain, here we have a dummy variable outcome, whether you do or do not have a job. And what we're saying here is our model simply says that this is a function of the given treatment that you're in and the stratum X. And we're going to think about a standard beta Bernoulli framework, which is then nested within a hierarchical framework. In other words, we allow for a beta Bernoulli model within each of our strata, and then we have learning across strata as the hierarchical framework would imply. Okay, so what
you have about 5 minutes left.
Thanks.
Sorry.
So what do we find? Thanks. What do we find? Well, at the 6-week employment rates, we find that nothing is affected by the interventions. You can see that very starkly here. You've got the control group, and then you've got the 3 treatments. And on the right here, we've got the differences from 0. Absolutely nothing significant. So as a consequence, if you look at the assignment probabilities in the way that we implemented it, even though we set up this algorithm that we're very excited about, they do not depart in a sustained way from 25%. One of my co-authors was watching these probabilities move and said that it was like following football results. He's Italian, and that's a high compliment. He was fascinated by watching this change week on week. But in fact, if you look at it over the course of the experiment, these are essentially flat, and that's reflective of the fact that in the 6-week follow-up data, we basically got everything sitting around the same levels. There is some heterogeneity at the strata level, and I won't take you through it, but you can see that not all of these strata are generating the same probabilities of success. And what the algorithm does, as I alluded to, is it will learn not just about the effectiveness of treatments, but effectiveness of treatments within strata. As a consequence, we can ask ourselves, how did the overall average employment change in our experiment compared to an experiment where we had just assigned people with equal probability? And we do find that there's a significant increase, but not large, of about 1 percentage point. That's to say, the hierarchical nature of our experiment that allowed for adaptivity, not only over time, but also across strata, seemed to help a little bit. What about midterm impacts? Here we're drawing on data from the 2-month and 4-month follow-up surveys. And as I explained, these were conducted face-to-face with somebody who was known and trusted by the respondent. I'm not going to show you anything from the Jordanian subsample. We find no effects there. For the Syrian subsample, a more interesting story. First, let's look at job search. So after 2 months, you can see that we have a significant increase in job search from the cash treatment. and large, although not quite significant, effects of the other two treatments, and a significant increase in applications across all three treatments. These are randomization inference p-values that you'll see in brackets here. If you then look at the main labor market outcomes at 2 months, you'll see an increase in the rate of employment, which is significant for all three of our treatments, and an increase in earnings significant for the cash and information treatment. Come back at the 4-month mark, and you'll see that that is persistent only in the case of the cash treatment. Still remains large and marginally significant for the information treatment. But we think that the take-home story is that cash matters for refugees in terms of helping them to find employment. A relatively large increase on a control mean of 5.2%, we go up by another 3.8 percentage points. And we've got an increase from almost 10 Jordanian dinar by about another 6.5 dinar. Now, this seems to indicate that liquidity constraints matter for refugees in terms of helping them to get into work. And we actually have a number of different corroborating factors that seem to support that. First, that job search intensity correlates with liquidity among the Syrian controls, but not among Jordanians, which is at least suggestive that liquidity constraints matter for search. Second, the impacts of the cash intervention seem to be driven by those individuals who have low baseline liquidity. Third, we've got additional impacts on retention. We actually did a prior elicitation exercise with IRC and also conducted qualitative work with some of our respondents, both of which exercises emphasize the importance of liquidity. And when we look at other literature, particularly technical reports written by large NGO agencies working with refugees, there is again often an emphasis there on the role of cash and liquidity constraints in order to facilitate job search. Now, I alluded several times to the distinction between our two surveys. We think that part of what's going on here is that the job seekers are in a context where it's quite sensitive whether they have formal work permitted by law or a slightly less formal job. And we think that much of what may be going on is that when the 6-week phone call arrives from somebody who is not known or trusted by the respondent, that respondents are interpreting that in very formal terms as being a question about whether they have a formal wage job, whereas the 2- and 4-month surveys are speaking more generally about wage employment. So we seeded our algorithm in a counterfactual way to say what would have happened had we used 2-month employment from that face-to-face survey rather than the rapid response 6-week survey. What you see from the red line here is the average proportion assigned to the best treatment for a given strata. And this indicates that had we taken that design choice rather than the 6-week rapid response choice, we actually would have seen a much more substantial deviation from that equal probability baseline case. I'm not going to summarize. I'm out of time. You've heard the talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd love to take some questions later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. That was great. Without much ado, I just pass it on to Jamie then.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. It's great to be able to present here. This is work that I've been doing with Carolina Mejia-Mintela from the World Bank for the last couple of years. And it's focused on self-integrity, locus of control, and their effects on labor market performance. And what we are going to report here is evidence from a field experiment in Addis Ababa. So to start with the motivation, so that kind of the broad kind of motivation for this is that youth inactivity is a major policy challenge. So this is just kind of data from the ILO in 2018, and it shows that about 1 in 5 young people are not in employment, education, or training. And of course, this has a kind of a knock-on effect because of its effect on mental health and human capital formation. So why are so many young people economically inactive? Well, there are kind of 3 conventional canonical explanations. One is the supply side, so reservation wages or expectations about job quality may be too high. And there have been a number of field experiments and other interventions targeting wage subsidies. Another explanation is on the demand side, so that young people may lack skills to contribute towards firms' productivity. So there are interventions and field experiments targeting socio-emotional skills and vocational skills. And there also might be search and friction. mismatches. So markets may not clear, for example, because information isn't getting between employers and job seekers, and there have been a number of market thickening interventions over the past decade or so. What this paper focuses on is a potential additional explanation, which is kind of psychology. And the motivation for this is that job search can be considered as a decision under uncertainty, the decision to kind of search or not, and decision about how much search effort to put in are going to be influenced by people's beliefs about the availability of jobs, the prevalence of nepotism, their locus of control, and their preferences and incentives. So their time preferences, their opportunity costs, and preference issues related to identity management and self-esteem, and so forth. And the idea here is that our intuition underlying the experiment that we did is that search inevitably entails rejection, and how you interpret those rejection is they're going to affect your beliefs about the world, and how you interpret that experience is going to be a factor both of the information or the experience of being rejected, but it's also going to be influenced by your kind of mental model of the world, and that's going to affect how that information is processed and understood. And this is going to affect your induced preferences over actions. So you're going to kind of depending on how you interpret a particular rejection, it's going to affect how you see the future, the return on investment for further search. And there is indicative and instructive evidence on this from Germany and India in recent kind of field experimental evidence and descriptive data. So the experiment here is in Addis Ababa, where prior to the pandemic, Ethiopia had one of the fastest growing economies, and yet it still had a high youth unemployment rate. And one particular reason why this is interesting is because another standard explanation is there just aren't available jobs. And in a context where the government has been engaging quite extensively on job creation, it's interesting to see in that context what kind of levers can be employed in terms of active labor market policy. Our experimental design, it was a 3-armed randomized control trial where we randomly allocated about 1,800 young people from 7 of the poorest districts in Addis Ababa to one of 3 conditions: a self-affirmation condition, and a condition that had self-affirmation exercises plus goal setting, and a control. And we pre-registered on the AEA. So the intervention is super short. It's a really light touch intervention. It's a 3-hour workshop that took place in local community spaces. So one of the advantages we think about this is that it actually could be operationalized as a government policy. Participants weren't paid to implement it, and it cost roughly about $7 per person, even when you take into account data collection. So it was actually a really cheap exercise compared to a lot of comparable exercises in this space. So the self-affirmation intervention, it was basically based on activities drawn from the experimental literature on self-integrity. These are summarized by Cohen and Sherman in 2014, but it's a broad set of exercises focused on helping people support their sense of self-integrity in the face of threats to that self-integrity. And then in the second intervention, we mixed the time. We split the time up into self-affirmation exercises and goal-setting exercises. And the goal exercises were drawn on the idea of mental contrasting and implementation intentions, which is a form of goal-setting that was developed by Gabriel Oettingen, and that's summarized in her book in 2015. And it's worth noting that we developed this in consultation with local experts who also delivered the intervention. So in summary, what did we find? Well, we found that the workshops increased both job search and employment for men, and the effects were small, but not for women. And one of our hypotheses is that it was because they were constrained by gender norms. A striking finding is that workshops were particularly effective for men with low locus of control at baseline. So they had a 30% increase in employment, 36% increase in days worked, and 34% increase in earnings. So just to go through the experiment, how we ran it. So we took a baseline where we took basic socio-demographic characteristics, time use, job search, and employment outcomes. And then we followed up with them with 6 phone surveys for 4 months, which were two weeks apart. And we captured job search, employment, and psychological outcomes. In terms of who the sample were, the average age was 23, around almost 60% were female, about a third were married, about 2/3 were born in Addis Ababa. The average years of education was slightly over 8. And very few had participated in training programs similar to this before, and almost the entire sample was literate. So our primary outcome was a summary index of job search at the extensive and intensive margins, and employment, so a summary index of economic activity at the extensive and intensive margins. We also captured earnings from wage and self-employment. And we wanted to investigate, in particular, 3 potential psychological mechanisms that could be explaining any changes that we found. So we captured locus of control, which were beliefs about the level of control that you have over the events in your life. Conscientiousness, which might be conceived as a preference for doing tasks well and honoring obligations to others. And time preferences, the relative value of receiving a good now compared to later. Our main specification we just did in an ANCOVA design, where we captured fixed effects at the WRADA level, at the regional level, at time, and at the interaction between time and region. It was an intention to treat design. I'm not going to go into much details of this now. So in terms of the results, so what we found was a small average treatment effect on job search, but no effect on work on average or on profits. And this is driven through the self-affirmation intervention, where we got about a 7% of a standard deviation of this index. We have no effect on goal setting from the goal setting intervention. And this is interesting because we were actually adding more material to the workshops. So one of the things that we've taken away from this is that even though psychological interventions they're cheap and they're often very low marginal cost in terms of the financial cost of adding them, there are costs, or they may be costs, to kind of adding content unless it's actually really unless adequate time is put into making sure that they're complementing. So the effects that we do find are driven by the intensive margin. So in other words, these effects are driven by, people aren't more likely to begin searching for work. It's the people who are searching for work are spending more time searching, given that they're searching. And this increases by roughly 9% in the self-affirmation treatment. And we also observe an effect from goal setting, but it's quite small. What we find on average is that there is an increase in conscientiousness. Again, it's at the threshold of significance, so this might not be anything. And what we as I'll show in a minute, where we think is the more interesting potential explanation is in the following, is in the slide or two. So the first major finding is, despite the small average treatment effects, there are no effects for women, not on search, not on work, or on profits. And so when we looked at to try and understand why that might be the case, well, we found that the target of the intervention was mostly focused on psychological components, but the constraints that women reported facing at the outset were largely to do with social norms. So kind of allocation of household responsibilities being the main one. So if the effects are driven by men, what was happening? So what we found again was that the self-affirmation was driving the effects for men, and there was small effects on work as well. So we find a 10% of a standard deviation increase in job search and a 12% of a standard deviation increase in the work index. This did not lead to statistically significant results in profits. What specifically, there was a major effect on the locus of control for men. So again, a reminder that the locus of control is a man's perceived agency, or a person's perceived agency, how the kind of control that they have over the events in their lives. And what we find is when we have a look at the kind of constraints that men were reporting at the outset of the intervention, at the baseline, men were much more likely to report lack of motivation and hope as the reason why they're not searching, compared to women, and compared to household responsibilities, which was the second most likely explanation. And then when we kind of dug further, what we find is that the men with low locus of control, they're responding quite strongly to the intervention. So in terms of work, they're much more likely to be in work, and they also have pretty economically significant increases in their earnings. So when we look at what's happening in terms of when we try to break out the impacts on work, what we find is that the work indicator increases by about, people are about 9% more likely to work. They're increasing by 38% the amount of a day that they're working, and the number of hours that they're working also increases. Finally, we look at what are the potential mediating effects. So we also look at their locus of control and their conscientiousness, and what we find is that there are really large increases in locus of control. And in summary, what we find is that these interventions can be effective if they're well targeted. So one of the things that we find, for example, is that it's specific types of men that were responding most to the interventions. So one thing that could be done, kind of similar into the vein of what Simon was talking about in the previous experiment, is to try and figure out what are the psychological traits of the people prior to implementing the intervention. The second major finding that we have is that implementation matters. When we added more material to the interventions, this appears to have diluted the effect. And then finally, I think understanding the gender situation prior to an intervention like this is essential. And if you are to get at the gender gaps in youth unemployment, which are really significant, then understanding and targeting different interventions for that are also important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That was great. Before I hand over to Laurel and the last presentation of the section, let me just remind everyone that you can post questions for the speakers in the Q&A using the Q&A function of Zoom. We'll most likely get to your question in the end, so that's your opportunity. And with that, Laurel, I'll hand over to you.
Oh, thank you. So this is joint work with Rob Garlick at Duke and Eric Johnson, Patrick Shaw, and Marissa Gargano, all at RTI International. The talk is divided into 4 parts, and I'll just start with a brief introduction. So to motivate the research project, we know that the hiring process has changed substantially in the past several decades. We've seen that these traditional search strategies involving handing out resumes in person or placing job advertisements in print have largely been replaced by lower cost online platforms. So today, online job search, posting, and matching platforms are increasingly common, not just in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And we've seen that both workers and firms report to using these platforms in several ways. We know that workers use platforms to research job openings, apply for jobs, and even study up on their interviewers. Firms report to using the platforms to post jobs and to screen applicants. And so by facilitating these activities, we believe that platform use may reduce some of those, or may serve to mitigate some of those information frictions and job search costs that have been documented in many different labor markets. So in this paper, we produced the first causal evidence on the effect of platform use on work seekers' labor market outcomes. Specifically, we ran a randomized evaluation of training work seekers in South Africa to join and use LinkedIn, which is one of the most popular digital professional networking platforms. So now I'm going to tell you exactly what we did. I will talk about the context, the sample population, the intervention, and then the research design. So this research takes place within the context of 4 large South African cities. And South Africa is a country with really high rates of youth unemployment, among the highest in the world. And South Africa is also a country with high overall rates of unemployment, which is due to a combination of factors. But so against the backdrop of relatively high unemployment, young work seekers face a particularly difficult transition into employment. The people in our sample are young work seekers from disadvantaged backgrounds. And by young, I mean that they are 18 to 29. And by disadvantaged, I mean that they are Black with little to no work experience, limited post-secondary education, and they come from low-income households. So these are work seekers that are negatively selected on employment prospects relative to the general population. We know from several recent papers that that work seekers matching this profile, they tend to face high search costs, they experience information frictions, and they also encounter discrimination in the labor market. So the work seekers in our sample are current participants in job readiness training programs. The job readiness programs last between 6 to 8 weeks, and they include team building exercises, non-cognitive skill development, and other training activities that prepare the participants for the workplace environment. And with some exceptions, the programs are mostly preparing participants for call center positions. So our intervention involves training participants to open and use LinkedIn accounts. So as you're all probably aware, LinkedIn is the most popular social media, one of the most popular social media sites specifically geared toward professional networking and development. So both work seekers and employers can create accounts and use the site. And although LinkedIn may not be as widely used in South Africa as it is in OECD countries, it is still quite well known in that context. So the intervention involves helping participants sign up to use LinkedIn, open an account, construct a meaningful profile, make connections, especially connections to program alum, to join groups and use LinkedIn to research jobs and firms, and even get a public recommendation from their job readiness trainer. So we co-developed this curriculum with our implementation partner, and if you're interested, you can view the entire curriculum in the paper appendix. So the entire LinkedIn training only displaced about 4 hours of the regular job readiness training programming. And that 4 hours was spread throughout the 6 to 8 weeks of the program. The LinkedIn training was delivered first as a sort of general introduction to LinkedIn presentation, which took place in the first week of the training program, and later delivered through in-person coaching, discussion sessions, and emails with advice and encouragement. So we worked with 30 of these job readiness training cohorts. We split the 30 cohorts into 15 treatment and 15 control, stratifying by city and time. So the treatment cohorts would receive the LinkedIn training on top of the regular job readiness training, and the control cohorts would just receive the regular job readiness training program. We measured labor market outcomes and beliefs by administering surveys at the end of the program and at 6 months and 12 months post-training. And then we also rely on 2 sources of administrative data. First, we measure program participation using administrative data collected by the job readiness trainer. And second, we measure LinkedIn usage using administrative data from LinkedIn. So we do have some missing data, but our results are not sensitive to adjusting for those missing values. Okay, so what do we find? I'm going to talk about that first in terms of the effect of LinkedIn training on LinkedIn use, then the effect of LinkedIn training on employment, and finally, I will conclude with a discussion about what we can say about the link between LinkedIn use and employment. So this is the first table that we show in our paper. This is basically just showing you that the intervention worked from a compliance standpoint. So the LinkedIn training increased LinkedIn usage both at the extensive and the intensive margin. We see that LinkedIn training increases the share of participants with LinkedIn accounts by 31 percentage points, and that the accounts were opened during the training program. So that's what you see in column 2. And we also construct an index of LinkedIn usage from a number of different measures, including the number and quality of your connections. And we find that treatment increases this index of LinkedIn usage by 0.94 standard deviations. But ultimately, we are interested in the labor market outcomes. So in this table, we show that the effect of training on employment at the end of the program, at 6 months and at 12 months post-training. And we find that the LinkedIn training has this immediate effect of increasing employment by 10%. And that effect is persistent. So you can see that even 12 months post-training, employment in the treated cohort is 7 percentage points higher. So it's not shown in this table, but we do also find that treatment increases the number of hours worked, although we show that that effect is largely being driven by this employment effect. So in addition to testing for the effect of LinkedIn training on employment, we also test for treatment effects on measures of employment quality. And we find that relative to control group jobs, treatment group jobs have a slightly higher probability of retention, although that effect is not statistically significant. And we don't find evidence of many other employment quality differences. So treatment group jobs and control group jobs have a similar probability of promotion and a similar probability of being permanent. So I think that the important takeaway there is that the marginal jobs are not of lower quality. The LinkedIn training does not appear to be improving employment probability simply by getting young people into lower quality positions. Now, unfortunately, we don't observe earnings, but we do estimate earnings gains based on 2 different scenarios. So in the first scenario, we assume that participants earn the mean wage for entry-level call center jobs. And in the second, more conservative scenario, we assume that participants earn the minimum wage for South Africa at the time. And depending on which assumption we make, we estimate that treatment increases earnings between $420 and $1,100 US over the course of 12 months. So importantly, this is another relatively low-cost intervention. Of course, this intervention does take place within the existing job readiness training program, but we estimate that the average variable cost of our intervention was $48 US per candidate. So if you compare the cost to the estimates of the earnings gains, you get a benefit to cost ratio ranging from 9 to 23. Okay, so you've seen that the LinkedIn training increases LinkedIn usage and that the LinkedIn training improved employment, but to what extent does the LinkedIn usage increase employment? Unfortunately, our experiment was not designed to answer that question directly, but we do propose a few ways in which we can use our results to conduct some sort of sanity checks that indirectly respond to the question. First, we find that LinkedIn use and employment are correlated at baseline and in the control group at inline. So this is non-experimental variation, but it is consistent with the notion that there are positive labor market returns to LinkedIn use. Second, we find that the effects on LinkedIn use occur before the effects on employment. In fact, the treatment effect on LinkedIn use occurs entirely during the job readiness training program. And that timing appears to be more consistent with the story that LinkedIn use is increasing employment rather than employment increasing LinkedIn use. And third, employment effects are larger for participants who do not have LinkedIn accounts at baseline. So we don't want to overinterpret that result because LinkedIn use at baseline also reflects baseline covariates, but it is another piece of evidence pointing toward the likely existence of a link between the LinkedIn training, LinkedIn use, and employment. So the final thing I want to talk about in this section is the set of economic mechanisms we considered. This is a question we get a lot. It's what do you think is responsible for this effect on employment? Why does training work seekers improve their employment prospects? So we didn't design the experiment to test for mechanisms, but we do present some suggestive evidence on 6 different mechanisms. First, we consider the role of supply side information frictions, and we actually believe that this is probably the most likely mechanism. So we see that training increases the number of jobs and profiles viewed by the work seeker, particularly in their last month of the training, which is consistent with this explanation that the work seekers are researching the firms conducting interviews. Second, we consider the role of demand side information frictions. We find mixed evidence on this mechanism. So we do see an increase in the number of times participants' profiles are viewed in the month of program completion. However, the HR staff we interviewed at a few of the hiring firms in our sample, they do not report to using LinkedIn to research job candidates. Third, we consider the role of referrals. And again, we find mixed evidence on this channel. We do see that treatment increases the number of connections, particularly high value connections. However, we don't see our work seekers connecting with anyone at the firms where they are eventually hired. Fourth, another mechanism we consider is that LinkedIn may reduce job search costs. We conclude that this is an unlikely mechanism. We see a tiny treatment effect on the number of job applications submitted through the platform, but this is from a very low baseline. And we also find no effect on the probability of getting a job through independent search. So the effect is explained entirely by applications submitted as part of the job training program. Fifth, we find no treatment effects on program completion or engagement, which suggests to us that this does not appear to be a behavioral story about how the LinkedIn training changed investment in job readiness training. And then finally, we consider the role of aspirations and self-beliefs. What we find is a small increase in reservation and aspiration wages, but those increases only occur after hiring. So again, we consider this to be an unlikely mechanism. So just to conclude, of all of those economic mechanisms we consider, we believe that the patterns are most consistent with supply-side learning. So in that case, what do work seekers learn about? Well, we conclude that they are not learning about new sectors because marginal employment is in call center jobs. Those are the targeted positions. However, marginal employment is with firms that are not partners of the job readiness training provider, suggesting that work seekers are learning about new firms in the targeted industry. And how do work seekers learn? So it seems to be more likely that they learn by the information they see in LinkedIn profiles than by the information they see in the job postings. And I say that because the treatment effects on profile views are larger. Okay, so I'd just like to conclude with a few thoughts about the implications of this work. So our research is consistent with this growing literature on the importance of information frictions in developing country labor markets. And I think that would be considered our first contribution. And second, our research can inform work on active labor market programs, or ALMPs. Specifically, we show that information frictions can bind even in targeted ALMPs. And we demonstrate how LinkedIn can be cheaply added to one of these existing programs. Also, based on our sample, we provide further support for research that focuses specifically on disadvantaged youths. But then finally, we'd also issue the caveat that with our design, we cannot speak to the effects at different scales or the effects of using different online platforms. So those would be questions that would have to be answered in future work.
Thank you very much, Laurel. Very interesting presentation and very interesting results. That was it for our 4 presenters. And now I'd like to open the floor for questions. I would like to start with Abi Kedir, who has a question for Annabelle, I think.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, I think simply put, my question is, for those who are employed, is there any effect of the on-the-job training on staying on the job, or maybe extending their durability or security in the job, if you have investigated that element?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a very interesting question, but unfortunately we haven't investigated this so far. But so in the moment we only looked at the extensive margins, so did they start paid employment or self-employment, but we will do that definitely in the future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Then next, Francis Thiel.
Lukas, maybe read his question out.
Okay, Francis asked, has a question for Simon, whether there are any constraints imposed by the government on what the refugees are allowed to do. I think, Simon, you kind of alluded to that a bit.
You know, yeah, thank you so much. No, thanks so much, Lucas, and thanks, Francis. I should have been much clearer about this because there definitely are, and I think it's important to understanding our results. So you're absolutely right. Under the Jordan Compact, these refugees would need to be able to be eligible for a work permit. And in particular, for our purposes, that means that they're not formally permitted to be starting a business, which is why we don't have a lot of questions in there about self-employment. And also it relates to the formality of the job that they get, which I think is part of the explanation for why we might be getting different results between the 6-week versus the 2 and 4 month follow-up. But thanks for clarifying. I should have been clearer on that. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Simon. Next, Paul Brimble has a question for Jamie.
Hello. Hi. I just wanted to ask about how difficult or perhaps easy it was for you to measure socio-emotional skills, such as locus of control over the phone. I think given COVID, these types of phone surveys have become very popular, and I think certain types of questions probably face different sort of difficulties. And so it would be great if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. And I think it's something that I know in the behavioral field, there has been a lot of concern that the quality of the indices that have been produced when being transported from high income contexts to low income contexts often isn't great. In summary, we actually found that there was a decent internal validity, or in terms of the Chronobox Alpha anyway, was decent for the locus of control measure. What we would need to do, and I need to check that, is to see whether there's a difference between when it was done in person and whether it was done over the phone, because I think these are two separate and interesting questions. One is whether the scales translate interculturally, and then separately, given you're translating it to another culture, is it additionally more challenging to do it over the phone? And so I don't actually have the answer to that. We would be able to check pretty easily whether it was more consistent on the phone. And I can actually I'll follow up with you on that, Paul, if that's okay.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Okay, next up, Theodora Sankova. I hope I pronounced that right. A question for Annabelle again.
Yes, thank you very much. So I have a quick question about the negative long-term effects of the job training program. So I'm wondering what can explain them, and especially because this is the treatment that was, in a way, the longest in duration, so the most intensive.
Yes. So this is also for us.
So we're going to transition to questions now, and we've had a good number of those come in.
Questioning to us. So this is very preliminary. So this is, as I also said on my last slide, something that we will investigate further, because in the moment we don't have a really good explanation for that. What is interesting that when I showed you the results for formal employment, we can see that this matches with the self-reported results. So that means that there is something going on, at least. So it's not just that our survey outcome measures were biased in some way. So there is something going on, and it seems that in this job training programs, the formal employment and also formal income increased as well. So yeah, we have to investigate this in the future. I think the first thing that we will now look at is at attrition, and we have definitely to check if the balancing is also okay when we consider only these different course types. So this is something we haven't done yet. So this is all what I can say to answer your question so far.
Okay, thank you, Annabelle. Next, Clément Imbert has a question for Laurel, I think.
Hi, Laurel. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I think it's great, great experiment. I had the first one comment, and it was an easy comment, but it's just at some point in the contribution, you seem to say that you were the first paper to evaluate the effect of the platform, but maybe I misunderstood it. Just to say that there's quite a few papers, at least I know one in the case of India and others in Europe doing this. But that's just a comment, and maybe I misunderstood. I guess the question I had was, do you think the platform provider would be happy with the results of your experiments? In the sense that you find those effects on employment, but you seem to be linking them to not to like an actual matching, but more like to the job seekers learning and sort of browsing and learning. And I'm saying this also with respect to the broader literature, at least this paper I mentioned in the chat by Kelly et al. That find basically no effect. So basically, when the platform is of poor quality, you find nothing, and maybe with a very good platform like the one you might be evaluating, you have some effects, but not really through the channel one would have expected.
So if I understand your question, you're asking how LinkedIn would perceive the results of this study. And I think my answer would be that I think that they're very happy for the positive publicity that that this study is responsible for. I'm not sure that they care so much the reason for the positive effect. I think if this is evidence that there are information frictions that that LinkedIn use could help mitigate, I think that LinkedIn, I mean, my impression is that they, maybe I don't understand your, but my impression is that they're actually quite happy to know this information. I think it also kind of speaks to something Jamie mentioned during his presentation, which is that this suggests that it's important to think about the specific context and targeting the intervention to the population is going to be most likely to benefit. So if this is about young people from disadvantaged backgrounds having experiencing particularly large information frictions, and LinkedIn could be a solution to tackle that, then I think that suggests the use of LinkedIn in similar contexts. So that would be my answer to that. Thank you also for the reference, and I would actually be interested if you would send me your other references from Europe, which I'm not aware of. So I would be interested to see those experiments that you referred to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laurel and Clément. Next up is Louise Fox, has a question for Jamie.
Good morning, well, afternoon there. So it seems like the women weren't really available for work, right? So you said you targeted unemployed women, but it seems like because of household chores and work, domestic work, they weren't actually available for work. And I'm wondering like how you screened for this or didn't screen for this. And also it seems like your building up the socio-emotional skills in women didn't really allow them to negotiate this better. So do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So the first thing to say is that the women actually, all participants in the study, both men and women, like were screened based on desire to work and availability for work in principle. And so obviously in practice, people are navigating that between multiple competing goals. But participants wouldn't have joined the study unless they wanted to participate in work. And we didn't, one thing to note on that as well, is that like a lot of experiments in our field experiments of this kind often provide incentives in order to keep participants in the study. And we didn't provide any, there was no kind of material benefit to actually participating in the intervention, in the activities. So my sense is that this was motivated by a goal to actually work, to develop skills for job search. To your point about navigating gender norms, absolutely, we did not do that. And I would say that in terms of the things, the repertoire of ideas that we might think about in terms of addressing those constraints, negotiation, and I know there are some people at Oxford who are doing some interesting stuff on that, will be one of them. There also is kind of questions around, the availability of formal and informal supports. So, I mean, I think that also was something that we were thinking about. But precisely to your point, what this intervention did not do, and what we found was insufficient, as a result was help work on strategies for negotiating or addressing gender norm related issues. These were entirely generic, related to self-affirmation, to do with and goal orientation. And you could maybe see where this might have an effect if there was a deep stigma associated with women in work, but this was not the case in Ethiopia. So that particular element, I don't think was as relevant. I hope that gets at your question.
Well, just a quick follow-up, which is, so did you have a follow-up interview with the women about why they joined the program if they weren't actually really available?
So we didn't do a follow-up we did not ask why we didn't do any follow-up interviews to ask why people participated in the program. I'm not sure if I would say that they were in principle available, but they were seeking to navigate it. So I think they had an interest in working, but they were seeking to navigate it. And our program did not address those kind of skills. And I think an interesting question is, if a program did provide those kind of skills, would they have effects on labor force participation? So I'm not sure if I would agree with this, with the basic kind of premise that there was no preference for work. I think they were interested in work, but the program didn't support them in actualizing that preference. If that gets, in other words, I don't think it was a preference issue. I think they wouldn't have joined. Like, it was quite clear that was kind of one of the rationale for the program.
Okay, Jamie, thank you. And thank you, Luis. I see Annabelle has a question, I think.
Yes, thank you. So I don't know, I'm not able to put type questions in.
Yeah, no, as a panelist, you can't. That's the Zoom functionality. I saw your raised hand. You did well.
So I have a question for Simon. I think your optimal treatment assignment algorithm is very interesting. However, I was not sure if I understood it correctly. So with what data did you feed the algorithm at the beginning?
Yeah, thank you very much. So you don't need data at the beginning. You have a very diffuse prior, but what that means, as I think you imply, is that the probability of assignment is 25% for everyone for all of the treatments for the first 6 weeks. And then after you start having data dropping into the system, then that will start to move. Now, we spent quite a bit of time thinking about whether we should use expert forecasts, because in principle, you could ask the IRC senior staff for their predictions, which we did anyway, and then you could use that in order to form the prior, feed that to the model, and then that would imply that you would be, in effect, it wouldn't be starting from the same starting point. You'd have different probabilities from the outset. But ultimately, we felt that we were sort of still committed to the principle of equipoise here. So we started at sort of diffuse prior, but more importantly, a very symmetric prior, which generates the 25%. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I should have clarified that. Thanks for asking.
Thank you both. I see Carolina, who is Jamie's co-author, has a question as well. Carolina, would you mind to unmuting yourself?
Yes, actually, it's more of a response to Louis' question than a question itself. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is that for why did women were not able to participate more and sort of change, and why did the treatment didn't change sort of those negotiation skills? I think we're missing out sort of the bargaining power that's attached to an actual income source there, right? So since we are not sort of tackling that, we would actually, it would be weird to see so that it was actually changing their bargaining power inside the household. And at the same time, we believe that, as Jamie was saying, genuinely they were interested and thought they will be able to figure it out, I think, at the beginning. But I guess it's when they face themselves with the challenge of having to actually look for a job, and they have the young brother, the small kid at home, is when they're not unable to find a solution for that.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to hand it back to the panel again. If there's any more questions you have for your fellow presenters or one of the other people in the panel, if they have a question, this would be the time to ask.
Thanks, Lukas. I had a question for Laurel, and maybe I missed it. I was wondering to what extent you can observe the user's ability to make connections on LinkedIn, and whether there is a network structure that you can back out to see whether network referrals, which might be important for job search processes, help explain some of your results, or might be an avenue to pursue for future work.
Yeah, unfortunately, we do see some measures of networks and network connections, but unfortunately we don't have data detailed enough to study some of those questions that might be a bit more interesting. So we see the number of connections a user has. We can see the quality of their connections. So we could see like the number of their connections who possess a bachelor's degree or who would be considered a manager at their firm. But we cannot see that individual X is connecting with individual Y. So we don't see, for the most part. So we can't study some of those referral stories that might be interesting to study. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, the one thing that we were able to look into is for the users who have on their LinkedIn profiles the firm where they are currently employed. So this is post-training. We can see whether that connection was made, whether the participant made a connection with someone had that firm on their profile. So that was kind of the way that we were trying to get at whether this was a referral story, whether whether participants were connecting with people at the firms where they eventually got hired. But it's a pretty coarse measure. So unfortunately, we don't have the really detailed data on networks.
Thank you both, Julio and Laurel. We have about 4 minutes left, so I just wanted to ask all of the presenters to take about a minute to if you can summarize their policy conclusions or kind of general conclusions for future work in that direction, research-wise, that you think would be interesting. That would be kind of something that you would like the audience to take away from your paper. Maybe starting in the same way as you presented. So Annabelle first.
Now it should work, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think what is very interesting and where there's really a black box in the terms of evaluating job training programs is what happens within the courses and what can we learn about training providers. So I had this on my last slide where we used training quality data, training provider quality data to see if this drives something of the results. And I think this is a very promising road for further future research to learn more about what is really offered in these courses, what is what degrees teachers have, what is the curriculum and stuff like that. So this is really a black box, not only in developing countries, also in Germany, for example.
Okay, thank you, Annabelle. Simon?
Thanks, Lukas. I think it's really two things for policymakers. First, the policy challenges around refugees and integrating refugees into local labour markets are not going away. Policymakers need to think about cash grants to help refugees to search for work in those kind of contexts. Second, as randomized controlled trials continue to grow in popularity, there's going to be more and more emphasis on integrating randomized controlled trials into the policy development process without having a stark distinction between the end of the RCT and the start of a scaled up policy rollout. And adaptive experimentation is one very useful way of bridging that gap.
Thank you, Simon. That was very clear. Jamie.
Thanks. I think there are two main takeaways for policy from this paper. The first is that psychological factors may actually play a role in labor market performance in a way that isn't fully kind of acknowledged in standard models, and that it can be a cost-effective intervention. And the second is that targeting really matters, because the intervention has kind of quite profoundly heterogeneous treatment effects, and that has two implications. First, there may be some people who don't respond at all to interventions, and if you target effectively through profiling at the baseline, you may be able to identify people who respond extremely well to the intervention.
Thank you, Jamie. And last but not least, Laurel.
So I think that this research suggests that young disadvantaged work seekers would benefit from additional information about the labor market. But I think that it also suggests that I think that more research is needed to understand the generalizability of this LinkedIn training to other labor market contexts. So South Africa presents a unique set of circumstances where LinkedIn is a platform that is well known, and there are enough job postings and profiles to actually provide young people with information. But then it's not commonly enough used that, for example, most of the participants in our study did not already have a LinkedIn profile. They were not already using it. So I am curious about the generalizability of the platform to other contexts.
Okay, thank you, Laurel. And thank you again to all of our speakers. This was really a great session. I took quite something away from it. Before we end the session, let me remind you of the other sessions today. Today is all about the labor market. And at 2 p.m. UK time, we have a session on young people and women in labor markets. And then at 4 p.m. UK time, we have a session on the effect of shocks on labor market outcomes. So 2 more exciting sessions about labor markets to come. I hope to see many of you there in the audience. Thank you very much for attending as well in the conference so far in the session today.